Well, good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are in the country. Nice to see so many gentlemen joining from coast to coast, so many Canadians. This is by far our biggest Sunday school workshop so far, so I'm really excited to see so many of you here. Obviously, this is a sore point for many people across Canada, and I've had literally hundreds of other messages asking if this is going to be recorded and if this will be available either on Mansion or online. But it will be both posted on Mansion, and it'll also be on the Complex Trauma Canada YouTube channel, so you can access it and review the content there. Kelsey's got a lot of content that in his presentation. We've been working on this for the last couple of days, and it's important that you're able to go back and review that because there is a ton of content and a ton of contacts as well. We've still got more people coming in. Ton of contacts that may be of assistance to you. For those of you who I haven't met personally, my name is Gavin McMillan, and I'm a lead facilitator with the Canadian Centre for Men and Families. And both for the Men's Peer Support Groups and for the Survivors of False Allegations group. You've probably been inundated by emails or with emails from me over the last little while, and I apologize if I'm getting a little bit tiresome, but I'm glad to see that you guys are all here. For those of you who don't know Kelsey, Kelsey is co-founder of Complex Trauma Canada. We started this company together about a year ago, and we're taking a child-centric approach to dealing with alienation. Parental alienation isn't typically viewed as something that is a palatable subject to discuss among political spheres, but child mental health and child health certainly is. So that's the reason why Complex Trauma Canada exists, and that's a big thrust behind what we're doing. Kelsey has been training at IFT Malta, which is the only university in the world which gives a master, or which has a master's certificate available for parental alienation. So Kelsey will be seeking to be qualified to speak as an expert in the Canadian courts as one of, I think, 3 or 4 people in Canada who have the credentials to do that. So I'm really very grateful, Kelsey, that you're able to spend some time with us today. And with that, I will turn it over to you. I'll manage the waiting room and let people in, so you can go ahead with your screen share.
Great, thanks, Gavin. I'm just gonna, hopefully this will work. Hopefully you can all see my screen there. Hopefully you can all hear me as well.
Yeah, you're good.
Good, all right. So I'm Kelsey Green. I'm a targeted parent. I have been involved with peer support with other targeted parents for about 3 or 4 years now. And I love this stuff so much, I guess, that I went off and did some education, some formal education of it. Just finishing up year's course this summer. So we're going to talk a lot about parental alienation, but one thing I would like to just touch on here briefly is that today is World Suicide Prevention Day, September 10th each year. And to connect this with parental alienation, there's been some research done in this area, but definitely not enough. But the research that's out there says that 23% of targeted parents have attempted suicide at least once. This rate is 400 times higher than the Canadian national average, 400 times. In another research study, 48% of targeted parents had suicide ideation. It means they thought about suicide, and 20% knew someone who died of suicide because of a child custody issue. We also know that children who are in high conflict separation or divorce, and it's combined with child abuse, which parental alienation we'll talk about in a little bit is a form of child abuse, have a lifelong risk of suicide as well as pathology. So suicide is one of the most serious, most critical issues with parental alienation, but I just wanted to take a moment and recognize today as World Suicide Prevention Day. So what we're going to discuss here is for information purposes. It's not medical or legal advice. It may help to inform some of the decisions you make, but it is not advice, and you should seek advice in those areas. I will also note that talking about parental alienation is a very personal experience for many people. So this presentation is not intended to cause you any distress, but it may activate some of your triggers. If that happens, try to look for a way to ground yourself, to stay with us, and then reach out to someone or seek medical attention if you need it. Some of you may know that Albert Einstein was alienated. And this is a letter that he wrote that's available online, where he says, "My fine boy has been alienated from me." And I'm just going to read the highlights. "By my wife, who has a vengeful disposition. If you only knew what I had to live through with her, you wouldn't hold it against me that I did not find the energy for so long to separate myself from her." The postcard I received from little Albert, that's his son, had been inspired, if not downright dictated by her. It said, "As long as you aren't friendlier with mama, I'm not going to go with you." And I think a lot of alienated parents can really connect with this. And we can see that anybody can be impacted by parental alienation. So today we're going to go through 5 different sections of the presentation. We are talking about parental alienation, which is an unjustified rejection of a parent. We're going to first focus on the understanding of parental alienation. What is it today? What does it mean today? How far back in history does it go? We're also going to then talk about identifying the signs. What does it sound like? What does it feel like? What do we know about alienation? How can we start to say, wait a second, maybe there's something else going on here? We're going to touch on the impact on the family. We're going to then touch on legal and therapeutic approaches and the need for them to be linked. And then we're going to talk on some practical tips for surviving until thriving and dealing with alienation, sort of with from a parent's perspective. And these are some of the things that we might see from a child. They say, "Mom says I can't hug dad in front of her because she will get mad." Parental alienation is one of the most damaging things that can happen to a child. That's by Dr. Amy J. Baker, an expert in parental alienation. What do we mean when we talk about parental alienation? Well, this is what I mean. Parental alienation is a term that's used to describe a process, so it means it's ongoing, where a child's relationship with one parent, the parent that we call the alienated parent or the targeted parent, is negatively influenced by the actions of the other parent, the alienating parent, or the preferred parent. And that results in the child's rejection of the targeted parent and the loss of a capable, loving parent from the lives of the child. And it has to be because of illogical, untrue, or exaggerated reasons. And that definition comes from a professor at UBC. His name is Edward Kruk, and others who have really looked into this and done a lot of research in this area. Now, I will say, and I want to make a clear point on this, that alienation cannot be determined by the sex or the gender of each parent. Alienation happens to men and to women. And in Canada, there's evidence that it happens more frequently to men. So parental alienation has been around for a long time. And I want to note that this presentation is text heavy, and I've done that for a specific reason. There is a lot of information here that different alienated or targeted parents will find useful. And I want to make sure that it's on the video so that people can go back and look at it. I will touch on things quickly. I may skip through some things a little bit, but there is information there that you may find useful, and I wanted to make sure that you could go back and have a look at it. It is a vast subject area, and they're depending on the structure and the format and where you are on your alienation journey, you may find different parts beneficial. But some of the earliest accounts of alienation, one of them was from court records in the UK, in a divorce between the Marchioness and the Marquess of Westmeath. But there's other legal cases around that time as well. Ball versus Ball in 1827. These are early 1800s. They don't always use the term alienation, but they use poisoning the child is something that they say. There's also references to parental alienation or alienating behaviors back in the US as well, dating back to the late 1800s, early 1900s. And there's a few Few very quite famous people that were also involved in alienation. And Charles Dickens, who was alive between 1812 and 1870, alienated his wife, the children from their mother. Albert Einstein, who you just heard, was alienated. But perhaps the oldest example of alienation might date back to the myth of Medea, which is a Greek myth from the about 700 BC. So this isn't a new subject. This isn't anything fantastical. These are bad behaviors by a parent that lead to really serious implications and repercussions. So somewhere around 1930s, there became a little bit more of research into this. And Wilhelm Reich wrote a book called Character Analysis that started to describe narcissistic behaviors and compulsive behaviors and started to put sort of the bones together as to what this picture might look like. We're going to talk about some of the other professionals who were doing research in that time, but when we really started to see things happening around alienation, it becoming more formalized in the research side of things, was Dr. Richard Gardner in the 1970s. So he wrote a book called The Boys and Girls Book About Divorce. And in that book, he said, parents sometimes use the children as weapons in divorce. We also saw the divorce rate start to spike in the 70s and especially in the 80s. So we saw more of these cases happening. And in 1985, or around about there, Richard Gardner coined the term parental alienation syndrome. Now, the definition for a syndrome was identified in the DSM at the time, and he used that definition. It's essentially a cluster of symptoms. There are people who've taken exception to that term. There's also people who have taken exception to Richard Gardner, saying that in 1985 he shouldn't have coined this. He didn't know what he was doing. But they forget all the research and all the evidence that dates back hundreds of years before that. There's also a number of other people who were evaluating and looking into these transitions in families and the children and what's happening in these really high conflict, or what they decide to call high conflict situations. Like Rivlin is one, Bendeck and Sketchy are others. They all identified the same issues. They just didn't put a name to it like Gardner did. But when Gardner put a name to it, that brought people out of the woodwork who then started to attack him. So nowadays we talk about parental alienation, and it is the unjustified rejection of a parent. So the way that we evaluate it now is we use the best practices using the 5-factor model. And this is identified by Burnett and Greenhill in 2021. Some people are saying that this should be called the Baker model, after Amy J. Baker, who was part of the development team. But there's 5 separate factors. Each one needs to be satisfied. The child refuses, opposes, or avoids contact with a parent. So is that happening? That's the first one. Second one, the child has had a prior positive relationship with that parent. And what that one means is just, did they do things together? Did they have a relationship? There are some times when a child is raised without a parent and they didn't have a prior positive relationship. But these all need to be evaluated by an expert to understand if they are really happening and within the terms of this 5-factor model. Is there an absence of bona fide abuse or neglect by the targeted parent? Because there's generally allegations of abuse and neglect in parental alienation cases, more often than not. But those allegations of abuse need to be considered and need to be understood. Has there really actually been abuse of the child? And then we get into alienating behaviors. And alienating behaviors are things that you'll want to learn and you'll want to understand. Is the preferred parent utilizing alienating behaviors? And we're going to talk about those in just a minute. And finally, is there symptoms of parental alienation in the child? Is the child showing symptoms? Is this child showing withdrawal, as well as other symptoms that we're going to talk about? Now, finally, it's not just that there is parental alienation or there's not parental alienation. There is a severity and a scale of parental alienation. Is it mild, is it moderate, or is it severe? Each type of scale, and this is why alienation needs to be evaluated, depending on the severity, that will dictate what type of treatment is going to work. So you need to evaluate the severity, and the experts can do that. So when we look at the behaviors, and I apologize, this slide is quite small with a lot of symptoms on here, but it's important to sort of look at some of the symptoms, the alienating behaviors. Now, to meet the 5-factor model, not only do you need the alienating strategies, but from the preferred parent and the behaviors in the child, but you don't need all of them. You don't need all of these alienating strategies to be present. And what's generally found is that there are certain preferences among the alienating parent that they will use. Maybe they'll force the child to choose. That would be strategy number 7. Maybe they'll interfere with communication. You write a letter and you send it to your child, and that letter never gets to your child, or maybe gets returned to you. Some parents, really will remove all communication. So they'll remove any medical or school information or sporting, anything like that, and take it away so the targeted parent can't see. And what we generally see is there are always a number of strategies that are there. Bad mouthing exists as well. And on the child side, we look into things like, why is the child rejecting the parent? And is there a real reason? Or is there a frivolous rationalization of why they're rejecting that parent? Ambivalence is like, well, they're kind of good and they're kind of bad, and there's some in between. But in a lot of alienated children, we see that they just react, and they don't have that ambivalence. This parent is all good and that parent is all bad, a form of splitting. They also often just determine that they're an independent thinker, and they've come up with this by themselves. Or they'll use what are called borrowed scenarios. That's where they take what the alienating parent says, and they use it, and they say, well, this is why I'm doing this. And we're going to talk about some of those in a little bit. But there's a few more things that are important to consider. The first is boundary violations. This is where a parent and a child may be too close. They may be sharing things that a parent-child relationship shouldn't be sharing. And some of these are minor, and some of these can be very severe. So looking at boundary violations is very important. We see a lot of over-empowerment of the child. Things like Timmy is 5 years old and should be able to choose which parent he sees when. And clearly a 5-year-old is not capable of making those types of decisions. We often see what's called enmeshment. That's when a child is brought into a new role to support the alienating parent. So we see parentification, adultification, or spouseification. Sometimes we see these very extreme behaviors that sometimes are even almost normalized in the family court system. But perjury on the stand, repeated and intentional violations of court orders, telling a child they don't have to follow the court order, these are all very extreme behaviors that need to be identified as that. Alienating parents are very good at creating these no-win double-bind situations. Once they have the child under their control, they will say things like, well, Melissa, our child, can go and see you, but only once she feels comfortable, knowing that Melissa will never feel comfortable unless she goes and spends time with the parent. A lot of counterintuitive behaviors, and we're going to talk about those as well. And we see a lot of misrepresentations or straight up lies from the alienating parent. And so these are all things that you want to take account of. And if you're going through it, start recording these. Start making a table with all these in it, and start recording the things that you're seeing. There will be so many of them that you will forget. So create a timeline about these. But parental alienation is more than just those behaviors. Parental alienation it starts with dysfunctional family systems. We see things like triangulation. That's where one person uses another person to get at a third person, and that's really what it is. And when it happens in the context of a family, we see things like inverted family hierarchies, or what Jay Haley called the perverse triangle. We see enmeshment or fusion, and these are all family systems terms that are very standard. And that's enmeshment is when the emotional ability for children gets connected right with their parent or with somebody else. Sometimes it's thought of as codependency. Terms are all very similar, but the extent of that enmeshment or fusion or codependency is what becomes a real challenge in some of these situations. We see low levels of differentiation, and this will result in poor long-term goal setting and achievement from the children. They don't know who they are. They don't know what they like. They don't know what they enjoy. They don't pull away like normal kids would as teenagers often. And differentiating oneself is very important. We know that family systems dysfunctions can cause mood and personality disorders later in life and other mental health impacts. And these things have been around. So Murray Bowen was researching in the 60s to the 80s, Salvador Minuchin around the same time, and Jay Haley sort of on the end of that. So if you're looking for information on family systems, those would sort of be your three people to start with. We also see intergenerational trauma and patterns of intergenerational behavior. We see that a parent who was alienated when they were a child will pass that same alienating behaviors onto their own children. We know that family violence is learned behavior. It's passed on from one generation to another. And parental alienation meets that same standard. So the children learn to survive in the hostile environment in which they're in, and they learn, but they often learn adaptive strategies that will not work later in life. Sometimes they don't learn to properly emotionally regulate themselves. That's something a parent's supposed to teach a child, but it doesn't always happen. And then the other part of PA is the attachments, or what's called the dynamic maturation model of attachments. Attachments were started by John Bowlby, and they were further advanced by Mary Ainsworth. And Patricia Crittenden created the dynamic maturation model, where she really broke attachments and strategies that are used in attachments down into the pie chart there of a number of different behaviors. Doing the adult attachment interview is a way that you can identify what strategies are being used and what treatment is needed in alienation cases. It's not used very often in Canada, but it's tremendously powerful, and it may be among the only tools that's empirically verified to be used with an alienated family. Most of the other ones that they use, like this test they use, are not empirically verified and shouldn't be used with alienating families, or sometimes even families going through divorce. But there's more to the story. Oh, okay. There is also coercive and controlling family violence happening when there's alienation. Alienation is we're just recently again recognized as being one strategy for someone who is perpetrating coercive and controlling family violence. Coercive control is a pattern of behaviors intended to gain control over the other person. And there's a number of strategies. There's what's now called and heavily researched called legal and administrative abuse. Dr. Alexandra Lasova, Emily Douglas, Denise Hines, Dawn Dutton, others have done a lot of research into this area. We often see false allegations, whether it's to police or child protection. We see child protection, receiving self-reports and sometimes multiple self-reports from one parent. And again, we see false reports to police. In these situations, we have one parent who is abusive and the other parent is abused. And most professionals will get it backwards because they're not trained to know. And finally, in alienation cases, there are a number of counterintuitives, a number of things that people think they know, which are totally backwards. So they will look at the alienating parent who shows up as cool, calm, charming, and convincing and think this parent is healthy and they're a good parent. And the targeted parent will show up anxious, agitated, angry, and afraid. And they will say, well, that parent must be the bad parent. We're going to remove the children from them. It's entirely backwards. An alienating parent is often cool and calm and charming and convincing, sometimes, maybe often, because they have personality disorders. They also think that an abused child will reject the parent that's abusive, and that's absolutely backwards. Abused children rarely reject abused parents, and sometimes those abused children protect that abusive parent for their entire lives. We also know that traditional therapies often make the situation worse, often catastrophically worse. And we also know that separating an alienated child from the alienating parent, that the risks of the child are very low, but letting that child remain with that parent, the risks are very high. So here are a few names that you should know. And I'm not going to read all of these off, but Richard Warshak was somebody who's been working in this field for a long time. Jennifer Harmon, Bill Burnett, and there are a number of others who've worked in this field. The reason it's important to know this is you will see and you will find that many of them are on Twitter, many of them are doing research, and all this information is out there. it's also going to come in handy later, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. So now we're going to talk about, what does parental alienation look like? How can you start to say, hey, this might actually be happening? It's not conclusive, but here are going to be some of the signs. And parental alienation is an emotional act of violence that is aimed at an adult, but critically wounds the child. Some of the things that we hear children saying on the top of the slide is, and some of these are board scenarios, some of them are independent thinker phenomenon. I don't want to see dad anymore because he put avocado on my toast. And that's clearly not a reason to see a parent anymore. Or sometimes just, I've always hated you, and I never want to see you anymore. You know, these things are very hurtful towards parents, because children don't say that. Children's attachments don't fail like that unless there's an external force. When I was 1, she would not change my diaper, said a 13-year-old child. And as I think most of us know, it's very hard to remember back to 1, because our brain structure just doesn't allow us to make memories. So clearly that 13-year-old was not hearing that. We also know that another child who was 11 said, under Article 12 of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, I do not have to see him again if I do not want to. But when asked, what is the UN Convention, the child had no response. But when saying these things, the children, and what they're really saying is, I feel safe enough with you to say the horrible stuff that I'm hearing and that is building up inside of me. Please know I don't mean it, and that I love you. But so when they're saying, and they can say some pretty nasty things sometimes, that's what they're really feeling on the inside. Sometimes all they're thinking is, something is really wrong, and I know only you can help. And often the kids start to feel sad themselves. So they start, I'm grieving each time I see you, Dad, and I don't know how to deal with these emotions. And a lot of the times the kids are saying, really, I love both parents, and I need some help to keep them both in my life. Now, when we think about the alienating parent, first of all, there's 3 types of alienators. There's the oblivious alienator, who's doing it without knowledge. There's an active alienator, and there's an obsessed alienator. The active and obsessed alienators behave a little bit more like each other, the obsessed being quite obsessed, often continuing the alienation and the abuse for many years, sometimes decades, 20, 30 years after separation. We know that most alienating parents have really high levels of anxiety. They often experienced abuse or neglect as a child themselves. There's a high likelihood that they have a personality disorder or are using personality disorder behaviors. They often get stuck in emotional processing, where they are ruled by their emotions and they start to have some cognitive distortions. They tend to be very skilled at gaslighting, triangulation, projection, and impression management that are all used to manipulate other people. They often use emotional blackmail. They undermine the other parent. They create false stories and false narratives in order to isolate the child. They often develop delusional belief systems, which can often lead them to really believing the false allegations that they're making. They really are emotionally stunted, and they lack critical thinking skills. It's been described as a child having a tantrum, except that child is an adult, and the tantrum is around the children and the loss of the relationship. We often see some fusion in the words of alienating parents, like, you should go to jail for what you've done to us. And first of all, what's been done is the relationship's ended. And second of all, the us is talking about that alienating parent and the children, which means that there's some belief that there's fusion there, that they're one and the same, and they're not. We often see, Jenny is old enough to decide when she sees you, and Jenny could just be a small child, clearly not old enough. We often see a lot of threats. If you leave me, I'll make sure you never see the kids again. And we often hear things like, the children hate you and never want to see you again. There's many more, but you'll see that it's the same behaviors, the same patterns, all done to try to gain control over a parent. The targeted parent. Targeted parents get stuck really in an unending or repeating cycle of grieving. We can't close the grieving process. And often when we see our children, if we see them maybe at the grocery store, or maybe we do get to see them once in a while, that grieving cycle will restart. We call this ambiguous loss. And often we don't have an outlet to go and speak to people about it. People don't understand. It's hard to grieve in process in public. And that disenfranchised grief is also a challenge for us. Targeted parents often have a hard time focusing. That can be on work. It can be especially on trying to address the alienation, whether it's through court or through therapy. They often start not enjoying their life. They become nervous. Maybe they shake in stressful situations. Emotions are rampant, so things like crying or anger outbursts can happen as well when triggers. Sometimes they really retreat into themselves or rarely leave their home. But what's really important to remember is that targeted parents are targeted because they are awesome, because they are good, amazing people who have empathy and really care about their children, and probably usually about a lot of people. Targeted parents have good morals and good values, and those are the things, from being a good person, those are the things that often leave good people open to being hurt like this. Parental alienation is a form of brainwashing that turns a child against a loving parent. That was by Dr. Stephen Miller. What is the impact of parental alienation on the child, especially when they're still a child? We know that alienated children often develop anxiety, depression, and PTSD. And we know that PTSD looks a little bit different. All those things actually look a little bit different in children. Most or a lot of experts that work with adults, they may not understand that depression and PTSD do show up differently in children. Kids get confused, and actually the alienating parent works to confuse the children. So if the child sees the targeted parent and has these emotions inside, children don't know how to label those emotions and understand what they are. So that the alienating parent will confuse the child and tell them, well, instead of feeling sad, you're actually scared. And the child will start to think that their emotion of feeling sad forever is feeling scared. The children also do generally feel guilt towards the targeted parent, but they have to repress this. They feel sad about what they're missing out on, but they do have to hide it away, or else it can be used against them by the alienating parent. The children really get pulled in two separate directions. They want to love and they want to be free, but they know they can't. Sometimes they do extremely well in school, and sometimes they do extremely poorly in school. If they're doing well, often the professionals will overlook it. But the alienated children will often isolate themselves because they feel like they're walking on eggshells and need to manage everything so the alienating parent doesn't get mad. But there are some long-term consequences with alienated children as well. They often have suppressed or limited morals, sometimes called flexible morals, where they have to make their way through the world. And they do it any way they can. They learn these poor strategies as a child and they apply them later in life. They often have limited critical thinking skills and really do emotional thinking or emotional reasoning, which means that as your emotions fluctuate, they're not on solid ground. They have the limited ability to plan for the future, and they can have some really serious difficulty in forming and keeping healthy relationships. Their unresolved childhood trauma, many of them do not address it throughout their life, and they just pass it on to the next generation. Sometimes we see sort of the failure to launch with alienated children who are stuck, they're enmeshed, they're fused with their alienating parent. There is an increased risk that they will either become an alienator themselves or become an alienated parent later in life. They sometimes lack empathy or are very good at shutting it down and not showing it. They use very primitive defenses such as splitting, an arrogant attitude, or projections in order to keep others away. The children often realize that if one parent is bad, that means that half of them is bad as well. And that can weigh heavy on children. And finally, we've already mentioned in the opening that there is an increased risk of not only pathology, which means mental health disorders, but of suicide as well in targeted children. Now, what happens to the targeted parent? Generally, we find that targeted parents experience a lot of loss, and it's not just their children. They often lose their children, but then their home, their job, their finances are in disarray. But they've also, on top of that, lost the trust in the world. Who can they trust? Who can they turn to when alienation is happening? We do know from a study back that started in 1979 and went to 1989 that divorced men are at greater risk of suicide during the time of divorce. Alienated parents would be a subset of those, but that does show that even divorce in itself or separation is a challenging time for men. That doesn't happen with women. Targeted parents have to really often relearn who they are, what they enjoy, who or what can they trust. They have to almost redevelop a life for themselves. They very regularly get diagnosed with anxiety, depression, and PTSD. And they turn to different coping mechanisms, such as physical activity, overworking, keeping busy, researching alienation, and sometimes friends or new friends to just try to keep their mind off of things. They often end up with moral injuries that result in a lack of trust for society. It can involve sometimes very subtle and sometimes not so subtle coercion, direction, misrepresentation, and so on. It's an abusive practice. It is child abuse when it occurs. It's emotionally abusive. This is from Dr. Stanbrook, and it's quoted in the case there, LMAN versus CPM. And that's in quite a number of court case decisions on parental alienation in Canada. So in order to heal and address parental alienation, there needs to be a legal and therapeutic approach. Lawyers are not typically trained in mental health. Mental health professionals are not trained in the law. When there is no court order in place for therapy, the alienating parent will do everything they can to avoid, disrupt, undermine, or cause that therapy to fail. So there needs to be a court order, and the therapy needs to be based on the best science and the best practice that's available. If it's a severe case of parental alienation, that means reunification therapy. If it's a mild case, there may be other family therapy that can be done. But in order for this to succeed for the child, there needs to be therapeutic jurisprudence, a combined effort from law and therapy. And that doesn't always happen. So with alienated parents, with the targeted parents, this one's very small, so go back to the video and have a look once it's posted. You're going to see a whole bunch of people coming to the aid of the alienating parent. You're going to see the police, you're going to see child protection, you're going to see a whole bunch of flying monkeys that are there to really support them. They don't really know what's going on. They've just decided, they've picked a side, and that's where they are. So some of the things you should do or should consider doing when you are, because the police will be involved, most likely, is you should start asking the police for their policies. What's your policy on domestic violence? What's your policy on child custody enforcement? And if they will not give them to you, which many of them won't, start making a Freedom of Information Act request for them. Get them to explain words that they're saying that you don't understand or that might have multiple meanings. Many alienating parents start recording either audio or video recording, or even streaming their interactions with police to often a private social media account. That information is then public, it's recorded. So if the police try to change the story later on, there is a recording. Know that police can't move children unless they are unsafe. But police aren't qualified to know if children are psychologically or emotionally unsafe, or who is the cause of that psychological or emotionally unsafe, being emotionally unsafe. Sometimes the police will be called on you for targeted parents for very frivolous or outright false and misleading statements or concerns, and point out to the police in those situations that that's public mischief. Making false reports to police is public mischief. It's also important to ask officers and anybody involved, do they know what coercive and controlling family violence is, and what's their training? And what is parental alienation? Do you know it? And how are you trained? And finally, because the whole entire family is experiencing trauma, it's important to continue to ask for trauma-informed officers to conduct the investigation. That way they will be more reasonable with every party involved with that case. Continue to not consent if they are moving you away from the grounds. Know your rights, learn your rights. Continue to do Freedom of Information Act requests from the police, each file that you get, and store it, archive it, scan it, make sure you keep a copy of it. And I'll talk more about why here in a second. Know that cyber stalking, following someone online, is a form of harassment and could be prosecuted under criminal harassment. And finally, I think most targeted parents will know this, that police generally will never enforce a family court order. They will say you need to go back to family court. They will say that you need an enforcement clause. And yet, the Judicature Acts in each province, or similar, they all say that every single court order is enforceable. So make sure you point that out to them. But they still won't enforce family court orders. They used to, but they've stopped. Now, what happens when you're working with child protection? Sometimes you'll get a false report to child protection. Ask for the child protection manual and policies under which they're working. Ask for the name and the registration number of all social workers who are there. Ask for their trauma-informed training and the training in parental alienation and coercive control. Consider recording or streaming live to social media, maybe a private account, all of your interactions with child protection. They do not want this because they know they're doing things that are unfavorable and that would not be seen well. This is really important because when they take you to court, child protection will often create reports that are not considering both sides of the story, just the side of the story that they want to present to court if you end up going there. Continue to make FOIPOPs or access to information requests for all of the files, and do that while their investigation is ongoing. So if they open an investigation, immediately issue a FOIPOP. Continue to be polite, continue to know your rights, continue to refuse to consent to things that they want you to consent to, and continue to let them know that you know this stuff. They will often make decisions about things that have no basis in science. There is no foundation for it. For example, you made a post about alienation on social media, and we've determined that that's emotional abuse of your child. There is no science behind that. That is an opinion. It is not a fact. It is not emotional abuse until there is adequate research to show that it is. But what is emotional abuse is parental alienation. Learn about their processes, their responsibilities. Generally, social workers cannot diagnose to the DSM. So ask them for a diagnosis from somebody who can diagnose, and ask them to get it done to child psychological abuse V995.51. Finally, send in papers and articles about parental alienation and truly be inquisitive whether or not what's happening in your family could be alienation. And finally, you're going to see a whole bunch of flying monkeys, and they're all going to come out of the woodwork. They're going to be teachers or school principals. There's going to be friends, neighbors, psychologists. Everybody is going to be triangulated against you. They're going to be told lies and misrepresentations. Often, the alienating parent's family, sometimes even your family is involved with this flying monkey behavior. So stand your ground, be the opposite of what the alienating parent makes you out to be. Your actions will speak louder than your words, and it takes time and consistency to show that. Show up to school functions, connect with those you know, share a few pieces of what's going on with you, and see where people stand. If they're interested, share more. As a Canadian, you have the right to make complaints against any professional. Now, these complaints may not always help, but neither will staying silent. So it is very important to try to address these cases early. The longer they go on, the harder they become to correct. Early intervention impacts the trauma that everyone experiences. It means that there is less jurisprudence, there's less weight, showing that it's not alienation. But sometimes you need to wait a little bit and put your case together and be a little bit strategic. start collecting and recording dates of when things happened, what happened, identifying them as alienating behaviors or manifestations in the child, and put the case together. So as much as this needs to be intervened early, sometimes, and in a lot of these cases, it won't be intervened. The intervention won't come until later. So note of caution here. Most university-educated psychologists and social workers do not actually get taught very much about attachments, almost nothing about family systems, a limited amount about complex trauma, and that's only been in recent years, and nothing about parental alienation. So unless they have specialist training, such as from Institute of Family Therapy in Malta, they were not qualified in parental alienation. So the first approach to therapeutic approach is to put in a final rule that this family is to approach a marriage and family therapist or systemic family therapist or someone who is trained in family systems, attachments, complex trauma, and do family therapy there. And this is usually given as the sort of the last chance to the alienating parent to make it happen. And if it doesn't happen, then the next step is to do what's called reunification therapy. This is psychoeducational therapy. This means it teaches children and parents how to behave, how to resolve conflicts, teaches them about things like triangulation and manipulation. It helps the child break free and deprogram themselves. Psychoeducational. It's not, it's very safe, it's very effective, and it should come with aftercare where the children are still connected to that professional later on to ensure that the progress continues. In severe cases, there is a need for a minimum of 90-day protective separation. So those kids can break free, recover who they are, and move forward. Now, when you're working with professionals, and this can be all sorts of professionals, it's important to realize that many professionals have egos, and some professionals have personality disorders or trauma that can also impact their work. And I would say that if your gut is not feeling it, it's probably not a fit with that professional. Some things to really consider are, do these professionals, do they know who Jennifer Harman, Richard Warshak, or William Burnett are? These are some of the leaders in the area of alienation. So if they don't, you might want to be cautious. And if they do, you could ask them what they know about them. We often see that many professionals are open to collaborating, learning new ideas, but there are some who are not. Trying to understand and try to ask that question up front. Are you open to collaborating with someone on this? Or would they consider strategic advice on parental alienation? Now, we see in a lot of cases of psychologists and social workers who don't understand alienation, we see what's called a therapeutic alignment. That's where the alienating parent is able to triangulate this professional into the disagreement, and the therapy will likely fail. So when there is therapeutic alignment, there will be therapeutic failure. And finally, when working with professionals, it's the judge who will make the determination of the outcome. So what do you or your lawyer know about that judge? What are their behaviors? What do they focus on? Some judges, if you mention parental alienation, they will remove your kids from you and you will not see them again. Other judges will say, I understand what parental alienation is, and I'm going to make sure that it's not happening in this case. Those are things you need to look into as much as anything else, is who is the judge you're having and what is their history. You can do a lot of that online. In these situations, we see biases galore. We see confirmation bias, but we also see base rate neglect. We see the affect heuristic. Affect is where people are making decisions based solely on emotion and not on actual logic and reason. Base rate neglect is where we say, look, 95% of cases of alienation cases are wrong. They are taken exactly wrong. They're exactly backwards. The anchoring effect, we see this all the time. Once a judge makes a decision, or once the police make a decision, nobody changes and varies from that decision. That's the anchoring effect. It's a very strong bias. We see premature closure, where decisions are ended without actually looking into them. And we see the fundamental attribution error, where we say, well, this person is showing up as angry. And well, yes, they should be. Their children are being removed from their lives. And that's how a normal person would behave. There's a lot of case law, and please go back to this section and start to look up some of these cases. They may be useful for you if you are going to court. As you probably know, appeals court cases are taken a little more seriously. So there's one there from New Brunswick. There's 3 of them from Ontario. The one there, AM versus CH, says that parental alienation is a finding of fact and does not require expert evidence. So if you are a parent and you can put the evidence together in a way that demonstrates it to the court, and this is a big challenge, the court can make a finding of alienation without having an expert present. And this is a newer change, so we'll see where it goes. Most of the time, most cases require an expert. There's a case down a little bit further, CJJ versus AJ from BC. This was one where 4 experts in parental alienation, including Amy Baker and Stephen Miller, did reports. One expert who was not an expert in alienation did a report, and it is a remarkable case. The judge finds heavily with the 4 experts, saying that the other expert really was not an expert and didn't know what he was doing. But there's some really interesting old cases like Tremblay versus Tremblay from '87 that says a parent should only be deprived of a child if there is abuse or neglect, and that a change of custody should happen if a parent refuses access or interferes with the parent-child relationship. So these are important ones. There's a few down there at the bottom about child protection if they get involved. A very recent one that came out just in the last week was AMH versus CAHH. It used to be that the status quo dictated. So if a parent just kept the children, that the other parent wouldn't get back in the picture because that was the status quo. But that decision said under the Divorce Act, that is not what happens. And Pintia versus Johns is a self-represented litigant case from the Supreme Court. If you're a self-represented litigant, you should be considering that one. A few cases that aren't talked about often in Canada, but really should be considered. Piskia versus Moldova. This is from the European Court of Human Rights. These become human rights issues. Not only is there a duty to exercise exceptional due diligence in these cases, but the state has an obligation to take positive measures to reunite children with their parents. IS versus and others versus Malta. Just because the parents don't get along doesn't mean that the state doesn't have to make sure that kids are in both of their lives. And there's a few others. Z versus Poland says court orders must be enforced. And KB and others versus Croatia says delays and shortcomings are not meeting the positive obligations of respecting family. So by delaying these things, it's causing challenge. Now, another interesting one that came out a few years ago was from the appeals court in India, the court system based on the British court system. So it is and can be admitted as a file in Canada. Said that parental alienation constitutes mental cruelty. This is from an appeals court. So that's a pretty strong conviction. There are more, but if you want to start with those, you'll find more. Stopping parental alienation requires a shift in focus from blaming the other parent to working together to create a positive environment for the child. From lawyer Brian Lubmer. So we've talked a lot about parental alienation. There is a lot more to talk about. And I'm going to be frank. Most cases of parental alienation don't get resolved. But all cases of parental alienation don't get fixed when you're not working to fix them. Right now, alienation cases go on, and if they're going to be changed, it usually takes in the range of 7 to 10 years for that to happen. And for many people, if your child is 10 to 13 years old, that means that they're going to be well beyond the reach of the family courts by the time this matter gets resolved. So many kids get alienated and they don't come back. You may have to, and I know that a lot of targeted parents do, grieve the loss of the relationship with their child. But you should also be looking at setting the groundwork to recover that relationship later on. You also have to accept that the relationship will not be what you thought it was, but that you can continue to work into the future. Amy Baker's done a lot of work on spontaneous reunification and reunification. She has an article out there called Beyond the High Road, which is about working with alienated children. And she has books like Restoring Family Connections, Surviving Parental Alienation, and Breaking the Ties That Bind. These are all great books to talk about what can you do when you have limited contact with your children who are alienated. But should your children come to you later in life What do you want to show your kids? What will you show your kids so that they know that you always wanted to be in their lives? That's one of the things the kids often ask is, why didn't you try harder? So what can you do? Okay, here's a few things. First thing is have shit tons of empathy for them. These children are being abused. They are going to say some nasty things at times, and know that it's not them talking to you. Do not take it personally. The first thing you have to do, and this comes from Amy Baker, is help them regulate their emotions. Help them, and sometimes that's sitting there with them. Sometimes that's telling them to understand, yes, I would feel angry if I were you too in this situation. Then you need to relate to them. And you need to see that they can relate to you. Have them understand, can I relate to my dad? Can I relate to them in their world? And only once they've regulated their emotions, have calmed down, and feel that connection building to you again, only then can you start to reason with them and use logic. Remember that kids, and kids even of older ages, they use emotions to think. They think and make decisions based on emotions, not logic like us. They have to grow up to do that. Second is looking at attachment-focused parenting. Maybe looking at things like circle of security, and try to help them heal from their attachment trauma. It can be challenging, but look into options there. Semantics. This is when words mean different things. So if a child says to you, I don't feel safe with you, say, what do you mean by safe? And be really genuinely authentic in understanding what they mean. Or say, look, you seem angry. What's caused it by angry? You know, why are you saying you're angry at me? What's happened? It's important to also set and hold reasonable boundaries and have empathy, because these reasonable boundaries may not be the reasonable boundaries you would have in a normal family situation, but they are reasonable boundaries for parenting with an alienated child, and you need to try. Also need to help them differentiate themselves. What do you like doing? Where do you want to go for supper? What kind of food would you like? What movies do you enjoy? Get them to talk about themselves as an individual. And very important is to teach them critical thinking. Ask them some big questions and use the Socratic method where all you do is ask them questions. You can't make a statement. All you can do is ask a question. But get them to think about things like, why do we have laws? Who makes the laws? What is fairness? Can it be fair to one person and not the other? Can you imagine a world without rules? Try to help expand their minds. Now, not all targeted parents have a chance to do these things. But what you can do is, if you do get a chance, make positive memories with them, things they will remember, pictures, send them those pictures, remind them of those positive times. They will sit in there and they will keep that child on life support. And most importantly here, chart your path, plan and do the right thing, and do it even though you're not getting any benefit from it in the short term. That'll be sending them letters, maybe send them in the mail. And if they get returned to you, keep them and hold on to them. Send them presents for birthdays, Christmas. Maybe they'll get returned, maybe they won't ever see them, but they will know that you're thinking about them. Sometimes you can have access to them through texting, sometimes that doesn't happen. But if you can, text them a place or an activity or an event, something that made you think about them, and tell them and text them why. Hey, I was thinking about you because do you remember when we went hiking and we saw this big tree? Well, I saw another big tree that reminded me just of it. And you'll trigger those memories in them. But you've also got to help yourself. You need to learn the law and you need to prepare. So that means keeping records, keeping photos, notes, recordings, and understanding what do you need to put together in order to argue your case in court. You need to understand, what are your coping strategies? Is it exercise, meditation? Is it research, spending time with friends? And when the emotions come on, when the trauma is activated, remember that time will pass and things will be better. Also find new things or rediscover those things that you enjoy. And maybe you want to develop sort of a new mission or new passions in life, take on a new hobby. At some point, you may start to say, well, maybe I can help somebody else. I've been down this road. I understand some of these things. I can respond to these horrific emails or text messages that I get now. How can you share that skill with somebody else? You probably have trauma. I don't think a person could go through alienation and not have trauma. So get support. Consider something like EMDR therapy that can help process trauma, and consider doing it regularly and early. if you find that you're becoming alienated, there may be a benefit in doing it right away. Sometimes you want to avoid therapy that can be triggering. Sometimes talking about things can just be a trigger, and some therapists don't know anything about alienation, so they can actually sort of gaslight you inadvertently. And one of the things that a lot of alienated parents run into is you kind of hit a wall when you're trying to get ready to go back to court, or when you're seeing the kids and your body actually says no and it tries to shut down. So try to figure out what you can do to get around that wall, get over it, get under it, or get through it. And if you know somebody who's been through this, maybe their experiences can help you a little bit. Your experience may be different, but you can always learn different parts from different people. Finally, well, not finally, I guess, but also importantly is try to stay in the lives of your children as you can. If they're at school, go to school. Find out when there's parent-teacher interviews. Be there, be involved, be friendly. Show up and bring them coffee and donuts for the teachers. You know, be there and don't talk about any of this. Just be positive and energetic in the school with all the kids. You know, with your child, also share your life. Share what you enjoy, share what you love, what excites you, what drives you, what you think is cool. They may not respond to it right now, but it will go into their mind and it'll sit there with them. With your own family, many families are very supportive. Some families might not be as supportive at times, but educate them, share information with them. Clearly ask your family what the support you need. I need you to help me with this. Support their relationship with your children, because they are also being impacted by the alienation. Sometimes you have to hold your family accountable and say, look, this is alienation and this is what's happening and this is why I need your help here. But also put yourself in your shoes and ask them to put themselves in your shoes. Activities. If your children are into activities, games, dance, recitals, music, go there, help, coach, reach out, get involved, put yourself out there. Be there, be involved, show them that you're showing up every day, that you want to see them, cheer for them if they're, doing something, get a t-shirt, made, do something that will be memorable for them, that you were there and I remember how you used to be there all the time. With the alienating parents family, recognize that there are generally always family systems issues in those families. It's often passed from generation to generation. And there will generally and quite often be shunned people from those families. Maybe in those families, every father was shunned, or maybe it was every mother or almost every mother. But look at the shunned people and go and find them and talk to them and understand their story, because they probably went through what you're going through as a targeted parent. Many of them will support the alienation. Many of them won't, will do it intentionally and with malice. So just know that and be aware. And finally, don't forget that you are worthy. You didn't cause the alienation, that you are important and you're not alone. With alienation, it often feels like we end up alone, and you're not. There is a huge percentage of the population, maybe as high as 20%, that is an alienated child, a targeted parent, or an alienated grandparent. There are many people out there, and if you talk to people, they will understand what you're going through on a level that they can understand. Now, preparing your case for court, here's a few tips. Think about what are the 10 most important items the court should know about this case. What should they know about your family, your child, and what's going on? Have examples of the 8 manifestations in the children, and have examples of the 17 alienating strategies in the parent. You don't need to have all of them covered, but have a few really solid examples in each one. Point out what are the intentional lies by the alienator, and identify the no-win double binds, right? They're like a no-win double bind. That is what you might see. If you don't go to court, you'll never see your child. Your child will continue to be alienated. But if you do go to court, you may still not see your child. So that's a no-win double bind. And start to point those out. They are all throughout alienation cases. And really point out the abnormal or the extreme behavior. What are some of the extreme things that have happened? Now, when you're going to court, you should also be thinking, what have you done to become the best parent that you can be? Have you attended parenting courses? Have you read books? Have you attended webinars and seminars? Do you have pictures that you can show how involved you were as a parent? Do you have a support person who can go to court with you on your day of court? Do you have a whole bunch that can go and sit in court with you? That's really important. Timeline, timeline, timeline. Create and update a timeline of when you're seeing your kids, what they're saying, what's happening, what the other person is saying. Keep a record and keep a spreadsheet or a Word document and keep adding to it. It's something you can send to your lawyer. It's something you can give to the courts. And always consider the best interests of your children. Those are different than any other children. Always consider the best interests of your children when you're making decisions and you're moving forward. And later on, after going through this, there may be a time where you are ready to help another. Helping can include things like being a support person in court, going to court for them, helping them prepare for court. Sometimes just being present and helping them work through documents can be very beneficial. While we all tend to have trauma, targeted parents tend to have trauma around their own traumatic events. Other people's trauma doesn't always activate them in the same way. You can also help them by having fun with them, or maybe if they see their children, go with them, go and have some fun, play a game. You might be able to help them find professionals that are supportive or other peer supports. You may be able to volunteer with an organization or share your story, write politicians, or go into politics. You may have other skills that could also help other targeted parents. So those are all things that when you're ready, you can give back and help others and try to prevent this from happening to others. So here's just a few resources that may be of interest to you. Each one is a little bit different. Eeny, meeny, miny, mo, EMMM.org.au out of Australia is a great resource for a whole bunch of stuff, as is Parental Alienation Europe. There's a Journal of Parental Alienation, Complex Trauma Canada, and PASG is the Parental Alienation Study Group. It's the world leading group on parental alienation. And Bill Burnett has the CKMVUMC.org one. So there's a lot of resources in there as well. So there was a lot of writing in this presentation, and please go back and review the slides and take the information that you like. I'd like to just leave with the perspective of Dr. Jennifer Jill Harmon, who's one of the world leading experts in parental alienation. She says stopping parental alienation requires a holistic approach that considers the emotional, psychological, and legal aspects of the co-parenting relationship. So it's quite a big picture. But I think Gavin and everyone, I think we'll end it there. And we will go forward on to questions in here just a few minutes, but I'll throw it back to you, Gavin.
Kelsey, thank you very much for that presentation. That was fantastic. I've got a couple of things. If you wouldn't mind just stopping the screen share. That would be awesome. Perfect. Thank you. A couple of things that I wanted to touch on just before we go to the Q&A, and certainly if you have questions, I'll do my best to manage them. Please use the hand raise function on your Zoom call or on your Zoom controls. I just wanted to talk very briefly. Kelsey touched on something called FOIPOP, and just for absolute clarity, that's FOIPOP is Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy. Just wanted to make sure that everyone knew what that was, and that wasn't something that was distracting or undefined. Kelsey, you talked about moral injuries. Would you mind just kind of doing a quick discussion, or I guess description, on the three parts of what a moral injury is?
Absolutely, absolutely. So a moral injury has three characteristics to it. And moral injuries can only happen to people that have morals. But first of all, there needs to be a transgression or a breach of your morals, something that acts against them. So that's the first one. It needs to be by a person in a position of authority, and it needs to be in something that is important to you. So if someone runs a red light and you say, well, I don't think you should run red lights, that's okay. It's not a serious situation, probably not going to be a moral injury. But if you have a police officer or a judge or a child protection worker impacting your child, and doing it in a way that removes them from your life, and you think that that's something that is important to your morals and values, then that can be a moral injury. It causes people to lose trust. It is different than PTSD, but it often co-occurs with PTSD. So if you want to learn more about that, we talked about that a few weeks ago in the trauma episode that's on Mention and on the YouTube channel.
Yeah, so that's on the Healing Unseen Wounds workshop that we did 2 or 3 weeks ago. And I'll, if you probably have the link for it already, but I can post the link in the chat if you're interested in reviewing that. Kelsey, I got a question for you. You mentioned that you know, there are 3 types of alienating parents. There's oblivious, active, and obsessed.
Mm-hmm.
Can someone be all 3 simultaneously?
It's more of a range of alienating behaviors, from someone who's doing it sort of unknowingly to someone who is doing it with extreme intention and is compulsively doing it. There may be somebody in the middle who's active, who knows they're doing it, but it's not a compulsion. It's not something that they're innately being forced to do. So generally, people fall into one of those 3s. I haven't seen any research if you can move from one to the next. Maybe you're oblivious at first and you realize it's getting you what you want, so then you become active, and then I haven't seen anything on that, but we do generally see them broken down into those 3 categories.
Thanks. I think you know, as I reflect on my own case, I think my ex is oblivious to the fact that she is harming our son. But I think she is active, and I think she is obsessed, and that's part of the reason why I asked that question. And there was an interesting quote that I saw a couple of weeks ago that was, "Never attribute something to malice that which should properly be attributed to incompetence." You know, I think sometimes people aren't actually aware that they're doing the things that they're doing. They may just be completely incompetent about their actions or behaviors.
With obsessed alienators, we do see really a compulsion, and they may come across sometimes like they don't know what they're doing, but generally they do, and they are doing it with a compulsion that they have to do it. You know, and it does seem that it's a trauma response from their childhood, similar to how, you know, somebody who maybe enjoys alcohol a little bit too much might be something that they don't have that much control over, although they know they do it. But it is often a compulsion with the obsessed alienator. So I don't think I've seen anything that says a naive alienator could be also an obsessed alienator.
Okay. Thanks also for your kind of future forecast of kind of how things will likely play out over the next kind of 7 to 10 years as we fight against alienation from our kids. I think there is certainly a light at the end of the tunnel, and I think the more people who engage with alienation in terms of how it's perceived by the courts, or by filing complaints, or by writing reviews about lawyers who may be engaging in and supporting alienating behaviors, the more it's going to become something that the public is generally aware of. And I think another interesting quote, what screws us up the most in life is the picture in our heads of how things are supposed to be. Maybe they're not going to be the way that we thought they were going to be, but maybe the new way that they're going to be will be as good or better. So I think it's important to obviously keep a positive outlook and keep fighting. Obviously, if you are willing and able, we'd love to see more volunteers for CCMF. I'm also putting 2 other links in the chat now. We're working with volunteers. We're looking for volunteers at Complex Trauma Canada, and also at the bestinterestofthechild.ca. So those links are both in the chat now. And I'll touch on that afterwards. We're so I'll stop the recording now, and we'll go to Q&A. So guys, you can feel free to turn your cameras back on now.